When you picture John Calvin, what comes to mind? Probably the stern, bearded guy from Geneva, right? The man who basically re engineered a faith. But what if I told you that the man we think we know is a bit of a ghost, and that the boy who grew up to become John Calvin is a total mystery? So, let's go on a little investigation, shall we? Let's piece together the clues that created one of the most influential people in history. So, look at this. On one side, you've got the legend, this towering figure of the Reformation. And on the other side, the boy, Jean Calvin. And the gap between them is just huge. We have practically no records, no childhood diaries, no nostalgic stories from him, just silence. So where do we even begin to solve a puzzle like that? And here's the really wild part. Calvin himself, in the thousands and thousands of pages he wrote, says almost nothing about his own childhood. It's like his life didn't really start until his mission did. So to find him, we have to become detectives. We have to look for the breadcrumbs, the little clues he left behind, probably without even realizing it. All right, so where's our first clue? Well, it's not in some dusty old birth certificate. It's in how Calvin saw himself. He had this way of reading his own life story through the pages of the Bible, basically finding himself in these ancient epic figures. And what this shows us is this massive contradiction right at his core. On one hand, he had this absolute rock-solid confidence that he was God's instrument, a prophet, an apostle. But at the very same time, he described himself as awkward, timid, and bashful, just full of regular human weakness. And that tension, right there, that's kind of the key to the whole man. And this quote, it just nails it. He's basically saying, hey, I'm just like King David. Remember him, the simple shepherd boy God plucked out of a field for this huge destiny? Well, Calvin saw himself the exact same way, as someone pulled from a humble, unknown background for a world-changing mission. In his mind, his life wasn't an accident. It was destiny. Okay, our next clue brings this humble boy down to earth. We're talking about a specific time, a specific place, and a family driven by some serious ambition, and not just the heavenly kind. So he starts life as Jean Calvin, up in northern France. His mom was very religious, but she died when he was just 6. The real powerhouse in his early life was his dad, Gerard. Now, this guy was a relentless social climber, and he saw the church as the ultimate ladder to success. So when John was only 12, his dad managed to get him a benefice. Think of it as a church-funded scholarship to pay for a really fancy education. The path was pretty much set for him. And get this, even the name Calvin isn't his real name. He kind of invented it. As a young scholar, he took his French name, Cauvin, and did what all the cool intellectual kids, the humanists, were doing. He Latinized it to Calvinus. And who was his role model? Not a saint, but the famous Roman orator, Cicero. This wasn't just a name change, it was a statement. He was branding himself as a serious thinker. Our third clue takes us to Paris. This is where his mind was really shaped, but in 2 totally different, conflicting ways. One was inspiring, and the other, well, it was absolutely brutal. First, he gets to study under this brilliant humanist teacher, Mathurin Cordier. For Cordier, you couldn't separate learning from faith. As he says here, what's the point of being smart if you aren't also devout? The goal was to shape you into a good Christian, not just a good student. A pretty noble idea, right? Yeah, well, it wasn't going to last. Because next, he ends up at the Collège de Montargis. And just look at this daily schedule. It's insane. You're up at 4 in the morning, in bed by 9 at night, and every single hour in between is scheduled. It was a punishing routine designed to break you down and instill an iron will. It was awful, but it forged a work ethic in Calvin that he kept for the rest of his life. And hey, don't just take my word for it. The famous scholar Erasmus went there around the same time, and he wrote about how terrible it was. The awful food, the freezing rooms, and, as you can see from this quote, the constant, cruel whippings, sometimes for no reason at all. This was the intense, harsh world that shaped Calvin as a teenager. Okay, for our last clue, we've got to zoom out, because what was happening outside the classroom walls was every bit as important. Calvin wasn't just getting an education in a vacuum, he was watching an entire kingdom teeter on the edge of a religious revolution. So while Calvin is hitting the books, France is a total whirlwind. You've got the king battling the Pope for control of the church. You've got Martin Luther's explosive ideas spreading in secret. The old guard at the Sorbonne in Paris is fighting back, calling it all heresy. And on top of that, a homegrown French reform movement is starting to bubble up.
It was an exciting but also an incredibly dangerous time to have strong opinions about God.
And this is a really important point. What was happening in France wasn't just a German import. This was its own unique battle for the soul of the church. It was a fight between the super traditionalist theologians and these new French reformers who wanted to combine modern learning with a purer form of faith. So let's put all our clues together. We have a young man who's been soaking up humanist ideas, who's been disciplined by a brutal education, who's living through a religious firestorm, and he's on the fast track to becoming a theologian. But then, everything changes. And the change doesn't come from Calvin himself. It comes from his dad. In Calvin's own words, his father had a sudden change of heart. He looked around and realized that lawyers, not theologians, were the ones getting rich. The divine calling could wait. A fat paycheck couldn't. And just like that, the whole life plan gets thrown out the window. That path to the priesthood, it's blocked. Calvin is ordered to pack his bags, leave Paris, and go study to become a lawyer. It's an abrupt, life-changing decision driven entirely by his dad's ambition. So think about what was forged in this invisible boy. He had the eloquent persuasion of a humanist, the sharp logical mind of a lawyer, and the absolute conviction of a prophet on a divine mission. So you have to wonder, was the revolution he eventually led just a historical accident? A strange outcome of his father's ambition? Or did all these different, conflicting forces make it inevitable?